So I'm Monika Chandler. I work with the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. So thank you very much for this opportunity to talk about updates with invasive plants in forests. So I'm not going to focus a lot on identification or management, but more of just what's new and different and updates. So we're going to start with regulation. So you're all fresh at the start of this webinar, so it seems like a good time to do the most boring stuff. So we'll talk about regulatory changes. So the Minnesota Department of Agriculture regulates 42 species as noxious weeds. So all but poison ivy of these species are non-native invasive plants. What makes them noxious is that they are regulated species. So you can go and see that list of plants, get more information on our weed program at this URL that's on the slide right now. So noxious weeds are organized into 4 categories. So the first category is the strictest regulation. So it's prohibited eradicate, which means that if a species is on the eradicate list, all propagating plant parts must be destroyed. And additionally, there can be no transportation, sale, or propagation of these species. Plants that are on the prohibited control list, these are more abundant species, and the aim is really to prevent them from spreading. So the regulation is that the landowner must prevent the dispersal of mature propagules. So often we're talking about seed. So really preventing something from going to seed. So for example, if there's plumeless thistle in a pasture, the landowner is not required to control that plumeless thistle, but does need to keep seed from maturing and blowing into the neighbor's pasture. The restricted list is generally, species on this list are more abundant species, so things like common buckthorn. And so a landowner is not required to control them, although ideally these plants would be controlled. They are bad actors, but there's no requirement to control them. But it is illegal to sell, propagate, move these species. So it can be really helpful to prevent continued sales and new introduction of some species. Specially regulated plants, this is where poison ivy fits in. This is a native plant, has a lot of wildlife benefits, but the regulations are such that a landowner could be asked to control poison ivy if it's in an area that's going to do people harm. Like if you have a store and you have a walkway lined in poison ivy, to get to the store, then that landowner could be forced to control that poison ivy. So those are the general lists. So what are the changes? Changes will come in 2020. So the noxious weed list is changed every 3 years. We try not to change it every year. We had feedback from county agricultural inspectors and other weed inspectors that annual changes were just too much to keep up with. So it changes every 3 years. So first on the list, and probably of interest to foresters here, is Norway Maple. Norway Maple will have very similar regulation to Amur Maple, where at the point of sale, there will be a label with this plant that says, do not plant within 100 yards of natural areas. This is just trying to the aim is to get the person who's doing the planting, making this decision on where to put this plant, to place it in an area where it's less likely to escape. Siberian Pee Shrub will be a restricted noxious weed, so that means that it won't be available for sale. So we know it's trouble, let's just not plant more of it. Japanese, Bohemian, and giant knotweeds will move from specially regulated. Their current regulation is a label at the point of sale saying do not plant in riparian areas. These plants are so damaging that they are being moved to the prohibited control list. So behind every species that's regulated in Minnesota, one big component of the decision of whether or not to regulate a species is a risk assessment. So a risk assessment is done for each species and is based upon the plant's biology, distribution, how hard it is to control, what is the likelihood that it can establish and spread in Minnesota. So these different questions answers to these questions are evaluated, and a decision is made about whether to regulate, and if so, what regulatory category a species should be put into. And so we do have some risk assessments in progress. Many of these are already regulated species. We are required to review the noxious weed list every 3 years. And if there are good reasons to update a risk assessment, then we do that. For example, with Leafy Spurge, there's a question of what species of euphorbia it really is right now. So there's some work that some euphorbia is Euphorbia virgata. It might be Euphorbia esula here. So there's some genetic work going on. So that would be an important change for our risk assessment. The two new ones on here are European alder and winged burning bush. So winged burning bush is a big deal to industry. So we want to be really careful with this assessment, make sure we're getting as robust of information as possible into it. So I'll start with some woody invasives, and there are many commonalities to woody invasives. So I'm going to focus today on buckthorn, Barbarian Bittersweet, because we have some updates on these. We could have added Asian bush honeysuckles as well, but I don't have any updates on them. So that's why they're not included. So all of these plants are native to Eurasia. They're all very competitive. That there are often more species in forests in Asia than in North America, so they tend to be very competitive. They do things like leaf out early, they retain their leaves long into the fall, so they have a longer growing season. One of the things that makes all of these species really difficult to control is that birds can vector the seed. So we might know where a large population is, but then when birds are moving the seed around, and in the case of Oriental Bittersweet, seed germinates better after passing through the gut of a bird than it does just falling to the ground. And so we have this dispersal, and it can be very difficult to find these populations that birds have planted. So hard to manage these plants. All of them displace native plants and degrade habitat, and all of them threaten forest regeneration. This is one we're probably all familiar with. This is common buckthorn. So here you can see this green leaf when in this shrub layer when the trees no longer have leaves. So that's a really common characteristic of these. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on ID, but if there are questions about whether a plant is buckthorn or not, one really great way to tell is to just slice some of that bark off and see if you see that bright orange underneath. What I will spend a little more time on is some distribution work that Matt Russell and Jason Reinhardt have been doing here at the University of Minnesota. So they've been looking at the distribution of common buckthorn to really try to better understand where should we be focusing our efforts on controlling populations. That sometimes with an abundant species like this, we're tempted to throw up our hands and say, there's nothing we can do. This is everywhere. But when we really look at this, no, it's not everywhere. And where are we going to get the best outcome with management efforts? Because we all have limited resources. Where should we be putting those resources? And to help answer this question as well, an economist here at the U, Bill Lazarus, is trying to look at these questions as well from an economic perspective. Again, where do we get the most bang for the buck with control? Also hot and new is this video series that Extension made. Soybean growers funded the creation of these videos, and they're really nicely done. So soybean buckthorn is a host of soybean aphid. So soybean aphid can overwinter on common buckthorn. And so soybean aphid populations are higher than the next growing season. And so ideally we would not have buckthorn and we would have less problems with soybean aphid. So, so this video series on identification, how to assess infestations, and kind of what are the first steps you take for management. An explanation of the soybean aphid and buckthorn interaction. And then the last video is on how to manage buckthorn, and it's really a practical guide to how do I do things like basal bark treatments, how do I do cut stump treatments. And so it's really great for woody invasive management in general, that it's focused on buckthorn here, but same ideas with other woody invasives. Something that's in progress but really interesting on the buckthorn front is this project that's at the University of Minnesota with looking at different plantings that are done after the first control effort with buckthorn. So the larger buckthorn plants are cut and treated. And then one would expect this flush of seedlings from the seed bank right afterward. And so what they're looking at is, can you plant certain species or species mixes that will shade out and crowd out the buckthorn seedlings so that they're not coming up and not dealing with this constant battle with the buckthorn seedlings. So that's in progress. They don't have conclusions out yet, but that'll be really interesting. Also in progress, really interesting, is this goat project. So there's so much interest in using goats for invasive plant management, but we lack information on how to best use goats and keep goats healthy, and it's complicated. And so hopefully this research will give us more guidance on how to better utilize goats. And so when thinking about buckthorn and we think, oh my gosh, it's a never-ending problem, what can we do? How do we really turn things around? I think it's really good to look at some of these success stories. So this is at Great River Bluff State Park in southeastern Minnesota on the Mississippi. And this area had been completely infested with buckthorn. It was just a solid wall of buckthorn. You wouldn't see the individual tree trunks. And so what they did is they first went through and cut and treated the large buckthorn. And then they've used fire every 2 to 3 years doing a burn. And that's really kept things looking great. I mean, you look at how nice and open this is. It's really restored the system, from what it was. Excuse me. Okay, and so now we'll move on to Japanese and common barberries. So when we think about Japanese barberry and how we use it a lot, it's used as an ornamental shrub. And here you can see it in this purple leaf form. It's nice, compact, growing in full sun. This is at the Bouchard Gardens in British Columbia. But we have problems with it invading our forests. So again, birds can take the seed from those plants in that ornamental setting and move them to areas where barberry does really, really well, which is forest understory. You can see that cutoff where the forest, see where the light becomes, where you get that higher light levels, no longer under the trees, and the barberry just kind of stops. It does really, really well growing under trees. So here you can see it leafed out. It's that bright green color, and the thing about barberry is that it has really sharp spines on it. So there is no way that I could move through this infestation without chaps on. And areas where land that had been wooded pasture, like cattle will not walk through this anymore. So in the Wabasha area, over 1,200 acres of what had been wooded pasture have been mapped as being pretty completely infested with Japanese barberry. So the story gets a little more complex because there's also common barberry, which is closely related. One of the distinguishing characteristics is that in some instances, there are multiple thorns. So here you can see these 3 thorns at the leaf axils in this picture, and then the fruit and flowers hang down in these clusters. And so those are some of the identifying characteristics. And why are we so worried about common barberry? is that it is a host of diseases of small grains, so black stem rust and stripe rust. And so small grains like wheat and barley, there is resistance to the current strains of black stem rust, that the resistance is bred into varieties of wheat that are planted now. But on common barberry, common barberry is key to the sexual reproduction of black stem rust, where then we could get crossing and new strains that things like wheat and barley are no longer resistant to. So there are a lot of concerns about that. Rusts have been historic concerns. So there were terrible outbreaks in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And so from 1918 until 1990, there was a common Barbary Eradication program. It was both federal and state level. And the idea was to find all common barberry plants and eradicate them, which was very, very hard. So like children were enlisted to help. You can see the picture of the pin here, where kids could come and they could get a pin if they reported a common barberry plant. And back in the early 1900s, they didn't have herbicides like we have. They didn't have the kind of power tools like we have. So killing barberry plants was really hard. For a large barberry plant, they'd have to use 100 pounds of salt that they would move on trains and then take it from there with horse and wagon. But they did it for all these years, through World War II, through the Great Depression. They did it. They kept going. And then in 1990, things kind of petered out, where there was still some common barberry around, but so even though the common barberry was around here and there wasn't that much left, and it was mostly in the southeast, which is not the wheat growing region. So it was thought, okay, the wheat is unlikely to be infected with any rusts on the common barberry in the southeast. But there is concern about resurging common barberry. And there's concern about what's happening out in naturalizing populations. So if we look at Japanese barberry cultivars, these three photos were taken on the St. Paul campus here. We could see the variety of size and form and leaf color of cultivars of all of what is called Japanese barberry. And all of the cultivars in trade have been tested, and they are resistant to stem rust. The issue that we're concerned about is that naturalizing populations have not been tested. And so what do these naturalizing populations look like? Most look like Japanese barberry. So they have single spines, and the fruit is often placed along the stem, which is indicative of Japanese barberry. All of the plants have been green, and they've all been pretty big, about 4 to 6 feet tall. So pretty hard to move through. But then we're seeing some mystery plants. So we're seeing something that looks like it's likely to be hybrid barberry. So you can see here these 3 thorns. We know that this is not straight up Japanese barberry. So it was DNR resource manager and conservation corps who was working with him who found these. These were reported to the Cereal Disease Lab. They've collected samples, sent them off to University of New Hampshire to test to see if we actually did find hybrid barberry, which would be a hybrid of common and Japanese barberry. Another difficulty with barberry infestations is that blackleg tick densities increase in barberry infestations. So in Lyme, Connecticut, where Lyme disease was first described, researchers looked at plots where some of the plots they removed the barberry, and they compared it to plots where barberry was left intact, and they found higher numbers of white-footed mice, which are often an important part of the Lyme disease cycle, as what the tick, the nymphs feed on early when they're very, they just hatch. And so there was higher white-footed mouse density. There was higher prevalence of the Lyme pathogen and higher prevalence of blackleg ticks in these plots. So we also are concerned about that. And additionally, the barberry creates this ideal habitat for blackleg ticks, it's like a microclimate kind of thing. So, so relative humidity is really important for blackleg ticks, and they dry out if they don't have the right relative humidity, and Barbary creates that really nicely. So now we'll move on to Oriental Bittersweet. So I think with this plant, it's really hard to overstate how devastating it is. This is a woody vine, and it grows up into the tree canopy, and it will, these vines are very heavy. They're large and heavy. Then you get snow and ice and high wind, and they just break the trees off. So this is in redwing, and you can see here where many trees are just downed or broken, and the vines are growing on top. So this is how they grow up the tree, like a python. They'll wrap around. They don't have aerial roots or anything like that to help them climb. So they do this wrapping. And then on the right, you can see a down tree that in the end, the vines just grow on top of the tree. And so leafed out, you can see that there's a Colorado blue spruce under that mound. And so you can see that when the vines are leafed out, that vegetation below them just don't get light and good growing conditions. So we're very interested in finding bittersweet, and we're focused right now on finding female plants that are producing a lot of fruit. That there's a fair amount of bittersweet in certain locations in Minnesota in the southeast, and so we know that we can't control all of the vines at once. So as a strategy, we're trying to find the female vines, and we're trying to do this with aerial survey because the southeast is really rugged. It's the bluff country. It's just hard to move through. It's hard to know where those vines are. So we're comparing using a quadcopter to a fixed wing drone, and we're comparing different kinds of cameras and seeing how that works out. So here you can see the fixed wing flying above the canopy. We're also looking at different heights, but it's hard because these areas are hilly. You have to fly at pretty high levels in order to make sure you're clearing the trees in all the areas. But the good news is we can find these fruiting vines. So here you can see the red fruit on those female vines. So we found these conditions to be ideal for flying. This was in the early winter. So there was just this skiff of snow on the ground, and that helped pop out the red of the fruit. And the fruit is most visible in the late fall into early winter. And so that worked really well. And so we could send in Conservation Corps field specialists to go to these locations, and they would go to these locations of each vine that was identified from the aerial imagery. And then if it was Oriental Bittersweet, they would cut it and treat it and make a report of that plant and that location and the work that was done. And so far, we've been over 90% accurate at being able to find these. So it's been really nice to see it come together. It kind of surprised us how good winter was until winter became so wintry, and the deep snow made everything much more difficult. Okay, so bittersweet work, control work is really pretty awful. It's very labor intensive. So it's a lot of chainsaws and herbicides. So it's just really hard to do when you get into those big infestations. Forestry mower has been used in a more heavily infested area. A bulldozer in the end finished the job in one area of Winona. So it's hard, heavy work, but the good news is that in areas where vines have been controlled, the trees respond really well. So here, this is the same tree. It might not look like it, but it is the same tree. So there were vines growing up it. In 2014, those vines were cut and treated. So you can see the brown on the left. You can see the brown of where the dead vines are. And then you can see some re-sprouting from the ground. So there are underground stems. They're starting to send up new shoots. So that's what you see at the base of the tree there. That's all that green. So then there was a retreatment in 2016, and then I revisited in 2018, and I was so pleased to see that there's been this real change. And this has been done on a much bigger scale as well. In Red Wing, one area where there was a lot of control work done, a bunch of, it was unclear exactly what was even in the infestation, and it turned out to be walnut trees, and they look beautiful. So that's heartening. Also heartening to see is people really working well together for bittersweet management. So in Winona, Ann Morris, who's on the left in this picture, she has really come up with this great strategy of local management. So neighborhood by neighborhood, they're hosting workshops. And one of the people in the neighborhood is hosting a workshop. The neighbors come and they learn how to identify and control bittersweet. At the end of it, they're given a small amount of herbicide and they go back to their land and they can continue this control work on their own land. So this is neighborhood by neighborhood. And so it's that ultra local approach, but that's what I think is really likely to lead to people who are very vested in protecting their lands and having this kind of long-term management in place. So now we'll switch gears to a couple of herbaceous plants. So garlic mustard is biennial and it overtakes forest understory areas, just spreads out. I think we're all pretty familiar with garlic mustard. So this is another species that we heard a lot about. Well, it's so abundant. What can we do about that? And I think this map by Jason and Matt has really shown us otherwise. So when we take a look at the distribution, we can see that this is not distributed statewide, and that controlling garlic mustard in areas where we see these more isolated pockets really makes a lot of sense to aggressively manage. And one of the tools we're really helping for management on those more abundant infestations, where you have the much larger scale, is biological control. But biological control has been in development my whole career in this field. So it's been a long story of testing in order to ensure that in this case, the stem and crown mining weevil, Pseudorhynchus scrobacalis, is specific to garlic mustard. So this specificity testing is done for both to prevent non-target damage, but also to make sure that you get an effective agent. To have an effective agent, you really need it honed in on your target species. So there's been so much host specificity testing, different petitions have been submitted. Finally, the USDA's technical advisory group recommended field release. The next step is an environmental assessment. If there's a finding of no significant impact, then APHIS will make a decision on whether or not these bioagents can be released in the United States. Canada moved faster. They have approved the release. There have been releases. The early indications, I heard that some feeding damage was observed last season, so that indicates that at least some of these weevils may have established, but that work will have to be continuing in Canada. But it's promising, and hopefully we'll be able to release these agents in the United States. And there are also two others. So this is a stem and crown mining weevil. There's also another stem mining weevil and a seed feeder. So also a plant that has biological control and development is common tansy. And so this is another plant that has an interesting distribution. It's really focused on the Northeast, and that's where the largest populations are, but you're starting to see populations pick up in some other areas as well. So, can we find these outlier populations and control them before they become so abundant? And for the areas where tansy is abundant, it would be hard to control with anything other than biological control. So it would be a great tool if we could find bioagents that are specific enough. So this research is being done in Switzerland, where they can, openly grow tansy and have these insects that are native to Eurasia. So it's a lot easier to do the work there. A fair amount of the garlic mustard work was done here at the University of Minnesota in quarantine, which is just harder and more expensive to work, but it was an important way to push that project forward. So this work is being done in Switzerland. So far, several potential candidates have been ruled out, and the host specificity testing continues on some of these other candidates. And then there are way more people to thank for all of this invasive plant work that's going on in the state than I could mention here, but Conservation Corps, Minnesota and Iowa have been tremendous partners in doing a lot of this invasive plant work and, really paying close attention. They're the ones who've been finding hybrid barberry along with a really excellent resource manager in the DNR. And Matt Russell and Jason Reinhardt are really helping with, they're really helping us to understand where these populations are, what's going on, what do we need to look at for spread, where should we be prioritizing. And Kurt Olson is the pilot of he's been doing the drone work, so he's in the College of Science and Engineering. And our Noxious Weed Advisory Committee advises the Commissioner of Agriculture on species regulation. So the committee, there are representatives of all different groups that make those decisions on which species should be listed and help write the risk assessments and do the evaluations. So that's really helpful for us. And then so many of my DNR and MnDOT colleagues and MDA colleagues, and then county agricultural inspectors have been key to getting a lot of the local work done on the ground, along with soil water conservation districts. With that, I'd be happy to take questions.
So yeah, we have time for questions. Monika, if you could, if anyone in here asks a question, just summarize it for the folks online. So
okay.
Context.
Yes.
So are any of the woody or herbaceous forest plants you talked about today, are they categorized as prohibited eradicate?
Oriental okay, so the question was, how are the woody invasives that were talked about in the presentation today regulated? So, and they're all different. So Oriental Bittersweet is a prohibited eradicate species. So most of the populations are in redwing and Winona. So pretty limited distribution. That's not to say that populations haven't popped up elsewhere, because this was an ornamental plant. So we people deliberately planted it here because it has this gorgeous fruit in the fall. And so populations have popped up in Duluth, out in Wright County, heading west of the metro. So there are several metro populations. So a lot of bittersweet plants didn't used to be labeled American bittersweet, which is our native bittersweet, versus Oriental bittersweet. They were just sold as bittersweet, and then planted some. And so the green industry was tremendous. When we were learning about these problems, they would notify their suppliers like, hey, we cannot accept Oriental bittersweet. We can't sell this. They destroyed a lot of stock that they had. So they were really, really great at getting that sorted out. And then common buckthorn is a restricted noxious weed. So that's an abundant species, not required to control it. It's great if you can, but because it would cause so much economic hardship to require that everyone control it, the decision was made to put it on the restricted list. For barberries, common barberry is on the prohibited control list. So common barberry would be prevent the spread. And then Japanese barberry had been specially regulated first, and and it's only 25 cultivars of Japanese barberry. So they're cultivars that produce 600 seeds or more per plant. This is based upon work done at the University of Connecticut on the seediness. So the idea is that plants with lower seed production are less likely to escape. There's no absolute, this is a bit arbitrary, but that was the decision making, was to regulate species that produce 600 seeds or more per plant on average. And so those 25 cultivars, there was a 3-year phase out of production, because that's a typical production cycle for the green industry. So there was a phase out, during which time they were specially regulated, and now those species cannot be, or sorry, those varieties can no longer be sold. So those are restricted noxious weeds now, because we're past that 3-year phase out.
I got a question from online. It says, you mentioned common buckthorn. How about other types of buckthorn, like glossy? And I guess they mean in terms of the problems management.
Right, so the question is, what about other types of buckthorn, like glossy buckthorn? So glossy buckthorn is another species that Matt and Jason have been looking at the distribution of, and I did not include it in the presentation today. Glossy buckthorn tends to be more of a wetland plant, and not as much into upland forests, but it could have been included. I didn't choose to, but it's also problematic as well, and one that we are quite concerned about, and it is a restricted noxious weed. So good point, and thank you for bringing that up.
Could you talk about the ways that you identify new locations or track spread? Do you have systematic inventories, aerial surveys, people, just individuals reporting? How does all that fit together?
Right, that's a great question. So how do we get distribution data? So we use EDMAPS, the Early Detection and Distribution Mapping System. There's a web, so invasive plant reports can come in through the web. They can come in through an app, the Great Lakes Early Detection Network app. And people can report invasive plants. So there are a wide range of approaches. So for example, with Oriental Bittersweet and eradicate list species, we've done a lot of surveys, right? We're very actively, you saw with the aerial survey, we're trying a lot of different methods to try and find every last bittersweet vine that we can. And so we put a lot of effort into on the ground survey, aerial survey. We do what we call windshield surveys, which tend to be road surveys. We also do walking in certain areas. So we really are trying to find every last vine. Some of the other species we aren't doing a lot of survey for. So common buckthorn, it's probably underreported in southwestern Minnesota, where I can see buckthorn in a lot of people's woodlots, but those are probably not being reported. So it depends on the species how much effort goes into survey for it. So that can impact the quality of the data. So I feel like we have a much better handle on Oriental Bittersweet distribution than we do really on common buckthorn distribution. Now, DNR has done some systematic surveys as well, and their data all go into EDMAPS. So EDMAPS is a way for us to share data across states and with Canada on invasive plant reports. Yes?
So to follow up from the previous question, if a private landowner were to find Oriental Bittersweet on their land, are there assistance programs, cost share programs that could help them in tackling that, or?
Sure, that's another great question. Thank you so much. So the question was, if a landowner finds Oriental Bittersweet on their property, is there assistance for that landowner? And at this moment, yes, it depends on funding. So funding is an ever-changing situation, as we all know. But currently, yes, there is some grant funding to help. And how that help comes might depend on the infestation. So some landowners, they would like technical help. You know, how do I do this? I'm willing to do the work, but what do I do? Other landowners, they may be totally unequipped to deal with a big infestation on their property. And so in some cases, we'll send in Conservation Corps crews. We'll write an agreement with that landowner and with Conservation Corps, and control work can be done on some private property. The challenge that we have is that there are way more people with bittersweet infestations than there are crew members to deal with it all. So that's the challenge. In Winona, they've come up with this approach of really trying to train people to do the work on their own land, which is terrific. And then we've combined that with dealing with crews doing work on the more heavily infested areas and the super heavily infested areas that are just dangerous for people to go into. The Soil Water Conservation District has some funding, cooperative weed management area funding, and they are using forestry mowers in some of those areas, as long as they're flat enough. That area is so hilly that it's difficult because of the slope. So depending on the infestation, we do try to help people out.
Could you talk about the role of nonprofit organizations and as well as like local units of government, such as Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board, for example, does a fair amount of work vis-a-vis invasive species. They're thinking of entities like the Nature Conservancy, Great River Greening, a whole array of other nonprofits that are engaged in invasive species removal and trying to get citizen volunteers and get grants and talk about the coordination with those entities, local government, and also at the Park and Recreation Board and then these nonprofits.
Right. So that's another great question about the role of nonprofits and volunteers and local governments and really having that very local effort at invasive plant control. And that is essential. Everything has to happen on a local level in the end. Like, in order to get on the ground management, it has to be very local. And so these groups are essential, like Great River Greening. The Nature Conservancy is amazing for the work that they do. And volunteers contribute so much. Extension coordinates a lot of master naturalist volunteers, and they've been doing a lot of on the ground invasive plant work. And so it's really it's that whole collaboration that's necessary at all different levels, and not just for the invasive plant work on the ground, but talking to other people about invasive plants and doing doing that outreach and education component too, that like Great River Greening does so well. So all of the work is essential. Like, no one entity can tackle invasive plants. It really has to be collaborative.
A couple questions from online. The first one is from Cedar Creek. Someone was asking, is there a place that they could send their pictures, etc., to help them identify invasives?
Okay, that's great. So the question is there a place that people can send their pictures to help identify whether a plant, what species, to identify that plant species and determine whether or not it's an invasive plant? So if a plant is suspected to be an invasive plant, someone can certainly create an EDMAPS report. So that can be done either through the Great Lakes Early Detection Network app or put into the website at edmaps.org. So that's an option, like if you suspect that you have an invasive plant, because each report is verified. So I am a plant verifier. There are a number of different plant verifiers throughout the state. And so we look at that report, and sometimes we can't tell. So we might go back to the person reporting and say, can you send me some more pictures? Or, oh, I think we need to go get a sample. We're going to have to put this on hold for a while. Or sometimes we can just look at it and say, oh, yes, it's this. And so no reports are released until they've been verified. So that's one way. Another option is iNaturalist app. They use AI, and so to help try to find the species, and I've heard it's pretty good. So that's another good tool for identification. People can also report invasive plants through iNaturalist. We tend to prefer that they go, because iNaturalist reports in the end will go into EdMaps. We tend to prefer that they go directly into EdMaps because we get the information sooner for high priority species.
Another question from online. This question says, my neighbor, who is a member of the local garden club, planted amber maple all across the front yard. Should I do anything about this? If so, what?
Okay, so the question is that a neighbor planted amber maple all across the front yard, and this neighbor is a part of a garden club. And so what do you do in these situations? So amber maple is a specially regulated plant. So there's nobody's legally required to control it. And amber maple is a beautiful small tree. That said, I've also seen infestations of amber maple, and amber maple infestations are not just in forested areas, they also are in sunny open field areas. So the real trick with amber maple is keeping it within that controlled landscape. So if the seed has nowhere to go really within its, like the area that it could spread, it's probably not going to do any harm. But this is all kind of in this, I'll call it this iffy realm of, what happens with a big storm, would the seed suddenly blow to some other area that would be a natural area and cause problems? It's hard to say, but nobody is required to control amber maple. But there can be nice conversations with neighbors about, what, could we plant something else or all that.
So the last question I have is from Cloquet. And the question is, what is the current regulatory status of Japanese knotweed in Minnesota?
Okay, so the question is, what is the current status of Japanese knotweed regulation in Minnesota? So currently it's a specially regulated plant. And so at the point of sale, there needs to be a label with the plant saying do not plant in riparian areas. And there's a definition of riparian areas. And this is because knotweeds can reproduce from fragments. So a fragment the size of like a fingernail can break off from a knotweed stem or rhizome or root and wash down a river, and then the next thing you know, you have so many infestations like along riverways. So that's a real concern. But knotweeds have proven so damaging in Great Britain that and some other areas that the decision was made based upon an updated risk assessment that Japanese knotweed will be a prohibited control species in 2020. One of the big findings with that risk assessment update, we thought that we had only female Japanese knotweed in Minnesota, but then we started hearing that knotweeds were spreading in Duluth in ways nobody could explain if that were the case, that if the plants could reproduce only from fragments, that if we had only female Japanese, there would be no seed reproduction, there would be only fragment reproduction, but what people were observing didn't make sense. So we started looking at that more closely, and we realized that there were Japanese knotweed plants that were producing seed, and in the same area, there were hybrid knotweed plants that were a pollen source. And so we didn't know that these hybrid knotweeds were even out there, but we found a lot of them, particularly in the Duluth area. So that was part of what drove the change to prohibited control as well, is that now there's also reproduction by seed.
Could you say a little more about the role of county agricultural inspectors? Who appoints them? What do they do? Do they get paid?
Right, so that's a really interesting question about the role of county agricultural inspectors. So each county is supposed to appoint a county agricultural inspector or a county designated employee. So that's the county's decision on who they're going to appoint. And sometimes these county ag inspectors are in soil water conservation districts, sometimes they're in public works, Sometimes they're in parks. So they can be in different areas. So Stearns County is the only county with a full-time county ag inspector, and he's terrific. And I think it's a good example of what can be accomplished when somebody is able to work full-time at Noxious Weeds. Every other county, all of these people wear multiple hats, and they are paid, but a lot of the time the county ag inspector part of their position is just one part of an already overflowing plate of responsibilities. And so it's hard for them to devote the kind of time that they want to. But they are the regulatory enforcers of the noxious weed law. That said, usually enforcement is not the road anybody wants to go down. So oftentimes they might know the landowner and they might be able to just say, hey, I'm getting complaints about Canada thistle. Can you mow it at this time of year? And that's actually the way a lot of weed work is done. In another instance, I know with the Stearns County Ag Inspector, we saw a giant spotted knapweed infestation, and he helped connect the landowner with like a grazing specialist who could write a grazing plan. And so spotted knapweed management ended up just being a small part of this much bigger pasture management approach. So they can really help connect landowners with different resources too.
So it's highly variable.
It's highly variable. It's highly variable.
In a
Yeah.
county like St. Louis County, it's an absurd job for asking somebody to do that in a county that's the size of a state. And,
Right.
you
Right.
know, they've got a bunch of other responsibilities.
Yeah. So the point is that St. Louis County, which is, I think the 3 states of Delaware could fit into St. Louis County. It's massive. And so how can a county ag inspector take on all of that? And that's where partnerships become so essential. So all these other groups helping to work on invasive plant issues. But they do have a really great ag inspector who's really trying to ramp up activity. She's still pretty new, but she's really getting stuff going up there. So.
Could you talk about the source of these invasives? Like what fraction comes from local landowners just planting some ornamental versus some accidental release versus some other kind of transfer? Right.
So the source of invasion. So it does depend on the species. So some species are, many of our early weed species came to us total accidental introductions, often with ship's ballast. So things like Leafy Spurge, that's one possibility. In Minnesota, we know Leafy Spurge came with like, specifically to Minnesota, with like a bushel of oats from Russia. Like it's actually that specific, we know. But that's unusual. But a lot of different invasive plants used to come to us that way. Was ship's ballast was just a moving soil, and then dumping the soil in your new location, and the next thing you know, you have a bunch of plants that are unfamiliar to our habitats. And so that was one problem. People have deliberately planted many of these species as well. So something like common tansy was seen as a very valuable plant. So like when the Massachusetts Bay Colony was getting established, they made sure they brought common tansy seed with them because like common tansy produces a lot of camphor. So it was used to keep bugs away. It was rubbed on meats as a preservative. It was used as a medicinal. So some of these plants were brought for a lot of different reasons. Common barberry, again, was seen as a very useful plant and brought here. And it used to be kind of a heroic thing to bring in new plants that had use to people. And then ornamental plants, we've certainly planted a lot of our ornamentals that later we find out, okay, this is trouble. We need to make changes in what we're doing.
All right. Any more questions here? All right. Thank you, Monika.
All right. Thank you.